They didn't vanish. They were erased, one whisper at a time, one lie at a time, one body at a time. And the worst part? No one was looking for them. That was the opening sentence of the classified 1871 memo, buried in the archives of what would eventually become the Office of Special Investigations. But the truth it hinted at was older, far older. Older than the Civil War. Older than the flag we pledge allegiance to. And it all began, on a spring morning in 1834, in a place no map dares mark anymore, the Sullivan basement. This isn't just a story, it's a descent, a reckoning. And if you're still watching, you're not like the others. You're not the kind of man who blinks when he hears the truth scratch at the walls of history. No, you're here because something inside you knows there's more, something buried deeper than bones. And tonight, we're going to dig. You see, the official records, what little survived, say that 47 children were discovered in a hidden basement beneath a farmhouse in Millbrook, Virginia. But the real number wasn't 47. It was 93. They counted the living. They didn't count the bones. The basement didn't appear overnight. It was engineered over decades, layer by layer, with a kind of obsessive precision that doesn't come from madness. It comes from belief. The Sullivans weren't insane. They were committed. And that, right there, is the most terrifying kind of evil, the kind that's deliberate. You've heard stories like this, maybe in passing. Urban legends.
Ghost tales.
But this one wasn't whispered to scare children. It was whispered to keep you asleep. This is forbidden history. And every second you stay here, you step further out of the lie. There were witnesses, dozens of them, who vanished after giving statements. Pages ripped from court ledgers. Names redacted in ink that bleeds under heat. And a woman named Constance Sullivan, whose voice was described by a surviving child as soft as sugar and sharp as razors. They called her Mother, not because they believed she was family, but because they were made to. And now you and I were going back, into that basement, into that silence, into that system designed not just to imprison bodies, but to rewrite minds. Are you ready? Then don't blink. Millbrook, Virginia was never meant to survive history. The town itself, if you can even call it that, was a patchwork of tobacco fields, crumbling homesteads, and people who knew better than to ask questions, especially about the Sullivan farm. But the land remembers, soil remembers, and when you dig deep enough, the truth seeps out like rot through wood. You see, what most men don't understand, what most will never understand, is that evil doesn't always come with fire and blood. Sometimes it comes with porches and pies, hymns and handshakes. The Sullivan family was respected, feared in a quiet way, not because of what they said, but because of what they didn't. Ezra Sullivan inherited the land in 1809. Old money, tobacco baron. But his wife, Constance, she didn't come from wealth. She came from somewhere else. And that's where things start to shift. No birth records, no family trail, just a sudden appearance in Henrio County. Beautiful, soft-spoken, and immediately persuasive. Some said she had the eyes of a woman who'd seen too much. Others said her eyes saw through you. Neighbors noticed odd things. Unusual construction, late-night labor. But they were good Southerners, God-fearing folk trained to mind their own business. Constance used that. She weaponized politeness. She understood one thing better than anyone else in the region. If you want to hide hell, bury it beneath routine. She told them the children were orphans, cousins from Pennsylvania, traumatized, shy, and people believed it, because belief is easier than confrontation. And confrontation requires courage, a currency in short supply among those who still depended on the Sullivans for grain and gossip. But the orphans weren't orphans. They weren't even from Virginia. Some were Dutch, some Haitian. At least one spoke only Greek. Different names, different faces, different screams. And yet, somehow they all called her the same thing. Mother. Imagine that. Imagine the kind of terror it takes to brainwash a child into calling their captor by the word meant for safety. The Sullivan basement wasn't a room. It was a system, a psychological labyrinth. They didn't just lock children up. They erased them. They studied obedience, rewarded silence, punished memory. And every time a child resisted, Constance didn't raise her voice. She didn't scream. She simply smiled and said, "Mother is disappointed. That's all it took. You're starting to see it now, aren't you? This wasn't a crime. It was a ritual. And it worked." What you have to understand is this: Constance Sullivan didn't just break children. She rewired them. You think torture looks like chains and whips? That's the kind of brutality amateurs use. But Constance, she was an architect of the mind. Her methods were older, sharper, refined through bloodlines that didn't keep written records but passed their knowledge hand to mouth, generation to generation. And in that basement, beneath that perfectly normal farmhouse, she built something more terrifying than any prison. She built compliance. There were no names down there. Names were stripped the moment a child entered. Instead, they were assigned numbers, then colors, then nothing. Language was taken next. Not all at once, no, that would cause rebellion. Instead, it was whittled down piece by piece, like carving flesh from a bone. Words became sounds. Sounds became silence. They were fed at irregular intervals. Sleep was earned. Light was used as punishment, not reward. And music, yes, there was music, was weaponized. A single lullaby, hummed by Constance herself, signaled either comfort or punishment. The melody meant nothing. The association meant everything. One child, rescued at age 11, remembered only 3 words in English: "Don't wake mother." Now listen to that again. Let it sink in. Don't wake mother. Not help me. Not where am I. Not even their own name. What kind of system takes away a child's entire self and replaces it with obedience so total? They fear waking the person who broke them. And here's where it gets darker. Behind the basement's eastern wall, investigators found an archive. One not kept on paper. It was painted. Carved by the children themselves. Symbols repeated across the stone. Circles inside circles. Teeth arranged in spirals. The word mother scratched 100 times over. But there was something else. One wall was filled with small handprints made in red. Not paint. Blood. Arranged in patterns so deliberate they weren't cries for help. They were rituals. Deputy Webb later described that wall in a personal letter to his wife as a door made of fingerprints. As if they were trying to open something that wasn't meant to be opened. Constance didn't just imprison those children physically. She imprisoned their souls. And you have to ask yourself, what kind of woman needs that many souls to stay young, to stay hidden, to stay powerful? Because this wasn't just cruelty. It was sacrifice. The deeper they went into the basement, the colder it got. Not just the chill of the earth, but the kind of cold that moves through you, as if the air itself is watching. Sheriff Crawford would later testify that the basement had no rats. No insects. No sign of life, not even mold in the corners of the stone. It wasn't natural. It wasn't dead. It was still, like a place waiting for its purpose to return. And when they reached the final room, buried behind 3 false walls and locked with an iron gate sealed in wax, they found something that no report, no statement, no confession would ever include in full. Because this wasn't just a crime scene. It was a shrine. At the center of the room sat a wooden chair, hand-carved, roped in leather, blackened by candle soot. Symbols covered the floor. Not drawn, branded, burned into the stone with such precision they shimmered in low light. The walls weren't blank. They were mirrors. Not the kind you find in homes, but old glass panels polished to reflect movement more than image. And in the mirrors, the officers claimed they saw things that didn't move when they did. That room didn't hold children. It held ritual. The kind used not for worship, but for transaction. Behind the chair was a ledger. One Crawford refused to discuss. But fragments of his journal leaked decades later, smuggled from the Henrio County vaults before they were sealed under national historical protection. He wrote, "She didn't want obedience. She wanted tribute. She was trading them, one by one, for something we weren't meant to name. You want to know why the records disappear? Why 3 officers resigned? Why 2 went mad? Because this wasn't just about the children. It was about what came after them. Witnesses described Constance aging in reverse. A woman in her 50s who moved like she was 30. Eyes too clear. Skin too unmarked. She should have been tired from the labor of caring for dozens of children. But she wasn't. She was alert, controlled, energized. And when confronted with the truth, she didn't cry. She didn't plead. She smiled. She smiled. That's what haunts men like Crawford. Not the bodies. Not the smell. But the look of a woman who believed she had done everything right. Now tell me something. If she smiled when caught, what do you think she saw waiting for her on the other side? They say justice came for Constance Sullivan. That she was arrested, tried, and hanged in Richmond by year's end. That the people of Virginia cleansed their conscience by burning the farmhouse down, salting the soil, and erecting a church atop its ashes. But that's a lie, a necessary lie, because the truth is too dangerous. There was no public trial.
No execution.
No newspaper headline. No body. Sheriff Crawford never filed an official arrest. Deputy Webb disappeared 3 months after the discovery. And as for Constance, she was last seen in April of 1834, stepping calmly into a black carriage bound for Washington, escorted by 3 men who showed no badges, but carried papers sealed with the crest of the early federal government. And just like that, she was gone.
No gravesite.
No record.
No closure.
The children, some survived, but they didn't return to society. They were relocated, reassigned, special wards of the state. Most were never named again. Their memories weren't just fractured, they were reprogrammed, cleaned, like chalk wiped from a slate. The few who did speak, mostly as adults decades later, described dreams, recurring nightmares of tunnels, of a humming voice, of a single phrase etched into their consciousness. We were never missing, just forgotten. Do you see now? This wasn't a failure of the system. This was the system. A control mechanism so advanced, so hidden, it doesn't even need to deny its crimes. It simply erases their existence. And every generation that follows is trained to look the other way, to call stories like this myth, folklore, rural legend. But legends don't leave claw marks under cellar doors. Legends don't leave burial pits full of small bones. And legends don't get sealed in vaults by presidential order. What Constance created wasn't a personal operation. It was a blueprint, a psychological structure of obedience and ritualized disappearance, replicated later in orphanages, asylums, correctional facilities, all under the same silent design. Take the forgotten. Make them disappear again. You were never supposed to know this, but now you do. And here's where I need you. Right now, comment these words below twice to lock in the truth inside you. I was not meant to sleep. I was meant to see. Do it. Out loud if you have to. In the comments if you dare. Because from here on out, you're not just a viewer. You're a witness. What makes a system last 200 years? It's not steel. It's not power. It's not even blood. It's silence. And silence is exactly what they harvested beneath the Sullivan farmhouse. You thought this story was about children? No, it's about design. About how power replicates itself through engineered trauma. Let me show you. One of the rooms in that basement, smaller than the rest, lined with stone shelves, contained rows of carved figurines. Crude, made of wood and bone. Each one represented a child. And at the bottom of every figurine was a symbol, carved so deep, the knife marks split the base. It was the same symbol found later in 3 other locations across the East Coast. One in a shuttered orphanage in Maryland, one behind a sealed door in a New York asylum, and one carved into the wall of a coal mine in Pennsylvania where immigrant children were forced into silent labor. Coincidence? Not even close. Constance wasn't alone. She was the Virginia node. A piece in a larger network. You see, history isn't just what's written in books. It's what's excluded, what's redacted. And the story of forgotten children isn't isolated. It's a through line that threads the very fabric of American development. Factories, workhouses, schoolhouses, all places where silence is trained into flesh. The children beneath the Sullivan house weren't just imprisoned. They were data. broken apart, documented, cataloged, their reactions measured, their spirits tested. You think that kind of knowledge vanishes? No, it evolves. It gets funded. It gets institutionalized. The same techniques used in that basement reappear, decades later, in government-funded behavior labs, in military re-education programs, in child correctional facilities with no public entry. And what do they always target? The orphaned, the abandoned, the voiceless, because a man with no past can be rebuilt, and a child with no name is perfect clay. You need to understand something dark. The Sullivan basement wasn't just an atrocity. It was a prototype, and once the prototype proved effective, once it showed how to erase identity, train obedience, and fracture the soul without leaving scars, it was copied. Right under your nose. In the systems you think protect you. In the buildings you walk past every day. And in the names you trust without question. Keep your eyes open. You're starting to see the pattern. By 1840, Virginia newspapers stopped printing anything about the Sullivans. It wasn't that people lost interest. It was that people were told to. Entire libraries reclassified the case under rural disturbances. The official police log of Henrio County lost 4 years of entries. And anyone who asked too many questions? They ended up relocated, discredited, or worse, declared mentally unstable and institutionalized for protection. The erasure wasn't sloppy. It was surgical. But one piece slipped through. A nurse named Eliza Trenholm, assigned briefly to one of the surviving children, kept a private diary. A fragment was recovered from her attic after her death in 1872. Water damaged, barely legible. But one line was repeated 5 times across 4 pages, always in the same ink. The girl draws the same door, even when asleep. That girl's name is gone now. Her records wiped. But in her drawings, charcoal scratches on thin paper, we see the same shape over and over again. A rectangular door, flanked by markings. But what's chilling is what the girl never drew. A doorknob.
No handle.
No way to open it. As if the door was only meant to be watched. As if it wasn't keeping something in, but waiting to let something out. What does this have to do with you? Everything. Because the real secret of the Sullivan basement isn't what they did down there. It's what they opened. You ever notice how some places make your chest tighten for no reason? How some houses feel wrong the moment you step in? It's not your imagination. It's residue. Spiritual fallout from old doorways left ajar, cracked open by people who believed they could control what answered back. Constance wasn't the architect of evil. She was its messenger. And like every good messenger, she didn't act alone. So here's the question nobody wants to ask. If the Sullivan door was only one, how many more are still hidden? How many more are waiting? You think basements are just rooms? Some of them are mouths. And they remember every name ever whispered in fear. So before you call this just a story, check your walls. See if anything's listening back. They called it the still room. That's what the children named it. The deepest chamber of the Sullivan basement. Not because it was silent, but because it made them still. They said once you were taken there, your body stopped shaking. Your voice stopped screaming. Not from peace but from pressure. Like something inside that space pressed down on your will. Like the air itself wanted to keep you quiet. The walls weren't brick like the rest of the basement. They were stone, smooth, almost black. The ceiling curved.
No corners. No sarpegis.
Just one continuous arc, like a ribcage. And at the center, a chair. Not a wooden one. Not iron. Bone. Polished. Bleached. Constructed from something large. Not animal. Not quite human. No one ever explained who or what sat in it. But according to fragments from Eliza Trenholm's journal, the children were brought to the still room one at a time. They weren't punished. They weren't questioned. They were observed. And when they came back, they were different, quieter, slower. Their eyes didn't follow movement the same way. Some stopped responding to their own names. Others developed strange compulsions, like writing symbols on their skin or whispering numbers into walls. And yet, they never fought back, never tried to escape, Not even when the door was left open. Because the still room didn't need locks. Conditioned loyalty. And here's the part that will keep you up at night. In 1957, an architect inspecting renovations under an old courthouse in Pennsylvania reported a sub-basement structure with an identical layout. Curved stone.
No corners.
One chair in the center. But before further investigation, the site was sealed by federal order. The blueprint had spread. You see the pattern now, don't you? These aren't accidents. These aren't isolated events. They're installations. Points of convergence. Places designed not to hold people, but to transform them. To unmake memory. To reprogram identity. To remove the idea of resistance. And the Sullivan basement was just the first known prototype. So ask yourself, what systems today demand your obedience? What institutions drain your will? Where are the places that make you forget who you were? Because maybe you were never free. Maybe you've just never seen your own still room. By the winter of 1835, a cartographer named Silas Venn was commissioned to map the outer fields surrounding the Sullivan estate for a proposed rail project. He never completed the survey. What he did leave behind was stranger than any map. Found in a leather-bound sketchbook after his death, one of the final pages shows a crude top-down drawing of the area behind the Sullivan house. Trees, rocks, fence lines. But in the center, an impossible structure. Perfect octagon nearly 40 feet across.
No visible entrance. No material labeled.
Just one word scrawled underneath in shaky handwriting. Echo. Venn's notes say he stood near the shape at dusk. The wind fell silent. Birds vanished. And then came the sound, low at first, then growing. Not an animal. Not weather. It was his own voice, repeating a sentence he hadn't spoken aloud. I want to go back. But there is no home. He wrote that it didn't come from around him, came from beneath. Here's what no one tells you about locations like the Sullivan site. They retain memory. Not metaphorically, literally. The soil, the walls, the very minerals remember frequency. Emotion. Pain. That's why certain places haunt. It's not ghosts, it's feedback. Echoes of unresolved trauma that replay when the conditions are right. And those octagonal structures? They're tuning forks. Ancient designs. Not modern at all. Found in desert monoliths, old catacombs, and tribal burial circles long before Constance Sullivan was born. So who built the one behind her home? More importantly, why? Because Silas Venn wasn't the only one who heard things. Several search party members reported hearing children crying underground even after the farmhouse was burned down. But when they dug,
No tunnels. No passageways.
just stone. Stone that bled when cracked. Let that settle. Stone that bled. You're dealing with something older than language. Older than maps. The Sullivan family didn't create this, they activated it. Willingly or not. And the children, they weren't just victims. They were batteries. Their fear, their silence, their psychic breakages. Fed something waiting just under the crust of normality. Something hungry, and still echoing. So the next time you pass an old property line, a forgotten patch of woods, a stone formation that doesn't belong, don't assume it's abandoned. Assume it's sleeping, and hope it doesn't remember your name. In 1861, decades after the Sullivan house was reduced to ash, a Confederate soldier named Harland Reese was stationed near Henrico County. While on patrol, he stumbled into a clearing he claimed had no birds, no breeze, no bugs, just silence. Thick, unnatural silence. And in that silence he heard chanting. Not from around him, not from the trees, but from beneath his feet. He dropped to his knees, pressed his ear to the ground, and what he heard would never leave him. Children, dozens of them, repeating a phrase he couldn't understand, a language that didn't match any he knew. But the rhythm was unmistakable. One voice, then many, then screaming. Harland fled. His diary stops the next day. A week later, he was found wandering barefoot 10 miles north, eyes bloodshot, nails torn down to the flesh. The only thing he could say, repeated over and over, was this: they were never missing. just forgotten. That phrase became legend in Virginia, used by drunks, whispers at bar tables, a campfire saying to scare newcomers. But what they didn't know is this: that phrase was written before Harland ever said it. In 1829, hidden in the margin of a Sullivan family ledger, one believed to be destroyed, Constance herself scribbled those exact words beside the names of 6 neighborhood children who had gone missing months prior. They were never missing, just forgotten. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a ritual loop. The forgotten become fuel. The erased become keys. And once a place is soaked in enough pain, it doesn't need new victims to operate. It becomes self-sustaining, like a cursed generator running off emotional residue. And here's what nobody wants to admit. The Sullivan basement still exists. Not physically, not in one location, but in pattern, in blueprint, in replication. Every missing person's case that vanishes without trace. Every child who's found years later with no memory of where they've been. Every institutionalized patient who speaks in symbols and draws doorways with no handles. These are not isolated events. They are symptoms. Signals that the system is still alive. Not on life support. Not in decay. But adapting. You've heard the whispers your whole life. The rooms that shouldn't feel cold. The photographs that distort faces. The feeling that something is just watching from inside the walls. It's not paranoia. It's recognition. Because something deep and patient has been watching you since before you were born. And it remembers exactly where you'll break. In 1904, a team of geologists from the University of Pennsylvania conducted a study on seismic anomalies in central Virginia. Their instruments picked up faint but rhythmic tremors that didn't match tectonic activity. Pulses, 5 seconds apart, always at 3:03 a.m. They traced the source to the abandoned plot where the Sullivan estate once stood. But when they drilled, they didn't find bedrock. They found bone, stacked, compressed, fossilized into the strata like someone or something had folded human remains into the very crust of the earth. No animal bones, no artifacts, just human femurs, dozens, some belonging to children not older than 5. What they found should have made headlines. But the lead geologist, Dr. Martin Halbier, was later declared mentally unstable after carving concentric circles into the floors of his home and telling his wife that the ones beneath are trying to reassemble. He was institutionalized. The study disappeared. And the land? It was quietly purchased by a church organization that no longer exists. But the name on the deed? Alara Ward. That name didn't appear in census records. No trace of her death. No living descendants. But in 1987, a janitor at the Virginia State Archives discovered a handwritten letter signed E.W., folded into a hymnal left in a locked drawer. Here's what it said. They fed the house to the fire but not what was underneath it. Fire can't unseal what pain has welcomed. That place is not haunted. It's listening. And now it's learning how to copy itself. It will not stay here forever. Understand this. This isn't a ghost story. It's an invitation. What happened in the Sullivan basement is not bound by location or time. It's a program, a psychic algorithm designed to exploit grief, neglect, isolation. Anywhere a child is unseen. Anywhere the system fails. Anywhere pain becomes pattern. It hides in bureaucracies. It wears the faces of caretakers. It lives in the silence of institutions that lose people and the archives that misfile evidence. And every generation it tests the world. It asks, will you forget again? And if you do, it grows stronger. The Sullivan basement isn't history. It's a template. And the scariest part? You've already been there. In dreams. In sleep paralysis. In the moments you swore someone whispered your name, but no one was in the room. That wasn't your mind playing tricks. That was recognition. In 1993. A 6-year-old girl named Rowan Mills vanished from a foster care center in Bedford County, Virginia. No signs of forced entry.
No witnesses.
Security footage? Erased. Not corrupted, cleanly wiped, as if never recorded. But 10 days later, she was found. Inside the walls of the same facility. Not behind them, inside them. A maintenance worker heard humming. He followed the sound to a sealed hallway that hadn't been used in decades. When he tapped on the drywall, it echoed, hollow. He cut into it. Rowan was there, standing, eyes open, smiling, perfectly clean. No injuries.
No dirt.
No memory of where she'd been. But she said something. Just one sentence. The man without hands told me not to scream. Authorities dismissed it, labeled it dissociative trauma. The staff were retrained. The drywall was replaced. But one worker, a woman named Carla Reese, kept a journal. She wrote down everything Rowan said during the following week. 7 entries. Each entry ended with the same phrase. He said the basement can fit more now. That's when Carla remembered something. Her grandmother had told her that same sentence when she was 6. And her grandmother's mother before that. It wasn't a memory. It was a script, passed down like a curse. Or worse, like a code embedded in generational trauma. Because here's what the Sullivan basement really is. It's not a place. It's not even a building. It's a system of access. A psychological lattice that forms whenever enough pain, neglect, and erasure intersect in one location. A hidden subfloor of human experience, beneath orphanages, hospitals, psych wards, even homes, designed to consume the forgotten and use their energy to replicate. And that replication? It's accelerating. In the last 10 years alone, over 34 children in Virginia have disappeared under identical conditions. Many were later found, changed, quiet, eyes dull, unable to draw anything but spiral staircases and doors that don't open. Authorities say they're victims of trauma. But we know better. We know what trauma really is in these stories. A delivery system. Pain is the password. Neglect is the key. And once it opens, you don't close it. So ask yourself this. Why do so many children, across generations, whisper the same words? Why do they smile when they say them? And why does every one of those phrases end with a number? A number that keeps increasing. The basement can fit more now. In 2006, a team of independent paranormal researchers, operating under the name Deep Room Protocol, traveled to what they believed was the original site of the Sullivan home. They brought ground-penetrating radar, low-frequency audio sensors, and thermal imaging equipment. They were never officially invited. They were warned not to enter, but they did. The footage they captured was never released publicly. Not because it was fake, but because someone else bought it. A silent acquisition. All 5 team members signed NDAs, except one. Her name was Lydia Grant. She died in 2010 under unusual cardiac circumstances, at the age of 39. But before her death, she left a hard drive with her brother. He leaked one audio file, 17 seconds long. In it, you hear her whisper, "We're deeper than the radar says we should be," and something is breathing on the other side of the wall. Then a voice, not hers, a man's voice, mechanical, glitching, repeating one line over and over like a broken record caught in prayer. The forgotten must be stacked spine to spine, or they start remembering. What does that mean? Ask yourself, what happens when a person is buried, not just physically but socially? Forgotten, scrubbed from memory, their names erased, their stories ignored. That kind of death isn't peaceful. It's pressurized. And under enough pressure, consciousness becomes volatile. Sentient. It reaches out. It wants back in. But it can't come through the light. So it comes through us. Through anyone who feels forgotten, overlooked, unloved. Through every child staring at a ceiling in a facility where no one calls them by name. Through every adult who wakes up remembering a hallway that never existed, but feels realer than the present. That's not imagination. That's a download. Lydia wrote in her final notes, "The basement is not where they're kept. It's where they're processed. Memories stripped. Voice codes erased. Identity burned out through repetition. They're not missing. They're muted." She ended the entry with one sentence, hand-scrawled in red ink. "If you hear the hymn at 3:03 a.m., do not sing along, because that's the true ritual. Not blood, not fire, consent. Once you repeat it, even in a whisper, you tell the basement you're ready to open your own door." And believe me, it's already inside your house. There's a man in Richmond who's never used a cell phone, never paid taxes, never appeared in any public database. Yet he exists. Lives in a condemned row house near Shockoe Bottom. Locals call him Chalk Man, because every morning, there's fresh chalk drawings on the sidewalk outside his gate. Hundreds of overlapping circles, spirals, phrases in dead languages, and always a message in English. Always one sentence. Always directed at no one and everyone. Don't follow the crying child. She's not crying. She's repeating. Urban myth? Maybe. Except that same sentence was found verbatim, scratched into the underside of a church pew in Appomattox in 1911, and painted on the walls of a mental institution in Staunton in 1949, and carved into the gums of a corpse in Loudoun County in 1976. It's not a message. It's a warning. Because the Sullivan basement isn't a ghost story. It's not even supernatural. It's a system override. A code-based infection passed through time, trauma, and repetition. The more it's spoken of, the more real it becomes. The basement doesn't need wood. It doesn't need blueprints. It needs memory. And once you remember it, once you believe it could exist, it uses your imagination to finish construction. That's the real trick. It makes you build it. In your own head. In your dreams. In the spaces you assume are safe, like a locked room, a dark stairwell, a gap under the bed. And then it waits. Just beneath your perception. Until one night you hear it. Not a scream. Not a growl. Just a voice. Whispering a sentence your blood already recognizes. You came back. Just like he said. Because maybe you were there before. Maybe you weren't just hearing the stories. Maybe you lived them. Maybe that hallway you always see in nightmares isn't just a dream. It's residual data. A leftover echo of the last time you were forgotten. And the Chalk Man? He's not warning you to stay away. He's warning you that you're already in. You just haven't reached the bottom yet. But you will. Because the moment you hear the crying child, and the moment you follow, that's when the real descent begins. And there's no staircase. Only memory. And a slow, cold drop that never stops. You think the Sullivan basement is just a metaphor? Then explain this. In 1983, a woman named Dr. Meredith Halloran, clinical neurologist at the University of Virginia, documented an unusual pattern of behavior in 6 unrelated patients. Different races, different cities, no shared history, but they all spoke the same phrase when sedated for EEG brain mapping. The door under the silence opens when you scream without making a sound. At first, she dismissed it as coincidence. Until the 7th patient, a 9-year-old boy named Daniel Jada, said something else. He was never prompted, wasn't under anesthesia, just waiting for his appointment. And out of nowhere, he whispered, "The quiet one's name is Bernard. He's the only one they didn't erase." Halloran froze. Bernard Sullivan, the father. The founder, the builder, the one who vanished. That name had never been spoken in front of Daniel. Not even once. No connection. No access. And when she asked him who told him that, he said, "The girl with the removed face." And then he started drawing. Hundreds of pages. Spiral-bound notebooks filled with floor plans of a house no one had shown him. Exact dimensions of a sublevel basement with 19 rooms, 3 ladders, no windows, and a single wall painted entirely black. He labeled that wall, "Where the loud people go." What did he mean? In Halloran's last public interview, she said this, "The myth of the basement isn't fiction. It's a psychological fallback. A universal code buried in the reptilian brain, activated by isolation, guilt, and ritual sound. The more pain you hide, the louder the door becomes. Pain is a key, and repetition is a trigger. And the ones who carry unspoken suffering, especially children, become conduits. They dream what others are told to forget. They remember the unspoken. They redraw blueprints that were burned. The Sullivan house was demolished in 1947. But in Daniel's drawings, the black wall had a phrase painted in red. "Only the quiet survive. Only the erased remain." Ask yourself, how could a 9-year-old know that? Why did he start screaming the moment they removed the notebook? Why did he stop speaking for the next 11 years? And why, when he finally did talk again in 1994, did he say only one sentence, "I've been to the wall, and the wall remembers me"? Now ask yourself this. A janitor named Leon Ward was cleaning out the archives beneath the Virginia State Library when he stumbled on a sealed crate marked confiscated materials, not for public review. The box had no catalog entry, no barcode, no digital record, not even a paper log, just a handwritten tag, Sullivan Estate / audio recordings / 1934 to 1946. Inside were 12 canisters of reel-to-reel magnetic tape, each one labeled with a different name. Some were familiar: victims, investigators, clergy. But 3 names didn't appear in any public registry: A. Fenwick, Mother Elsie, and simply, the black teacher Ward, curious and careless, took one reel home. He never made it through the first 10 minutes, because the audio didn't begin with voices. It began with shuffling, breathing, scratching, and then a faint chant, spoken over and over in a circular rhythm. The door must stay shut. The mouth must stay dry. The dream must stay buried. Then silence. Then a child's voice, not crying, not scared, just resigned, like someone narrating their own funeral. I remember the ceiling. It's upside down. The people walk on it. They hang the mirrors so we forget which way is up. That's how they know you're ready. And then it ends.
No static.
No click. Just a hard cutoff, like reality itself had been censored. Leon never played another reel. Within 2 weeks, he quit his job, filed a restraining order against the library, and moved off-grid to a trailer in West Virginia. He told his sister, "They're not tapes, they're keys. Each one opens a different version of the basement. And if you play all of them, you don't come back up." She didn't believe him until he went missing in 1998. Trailer left locked from the inside.
No footprints. No struggle.
No signs of a break-in. Just a dusty cassette player still spinning. And a sentence written in condensation on the mirror above his sink. "I remember you." And here's the part no one likes to admit. There are more tapes. Unarchived. Unlabeled. Circulating in antique shops, estate sales, and forgotten libraries. Some are blank. Others aren't. Some are waiting. And if one ever finds its way to you, don't play it out of curiosity. Because it's not just sound. It's instruction. There are photographs. But you won't find them in any museum, gallery, or archive. You won't see them in books or documentaries. Because every time someone tries to publish them, something happens. A file gets corrupted, a publisher drops the project, a technical issue wipes the entire drive. But a few have survived. Passed hand to hand in brown paper envelopes, hidden behind false backs of family portraits, whispered about in fringe forums under usernames that go dead within days. And all of them have one thing in common. Children. Not smiling. Not playing. Not looking at the camera. They're standing perfectly still. In rooms too clean, with shadows too deep, and faces too edited. Some of the photos are dated. Others aren't. But every single one has a marking on the back. Usually in red pencil. SB 19B Level 19 Quiet Originals. The implication is chilling. 19 original children. 19 rooms in the Sullivan basement. 19 recorded sessions. And in at least 7 of the photos, if you invert the image colors and increase the contrast, a figure appears in the reflection of the window or glass. The same figure. Every time. He's wearing a black suit. No face. No hands. Just a silhouette. But his posture is unmistakable. He's watching them. He's always been watching them. Researchers who've studied these photos call him the auditor. Others refer to him as the black teacher. And in one handwritten margin note, believed to be in Bernard Sullivan's own handwriting, he's labeled simply, "Corrective Presence," for those who remember out loud. And what does that mean? It means some of those children were starting to talk. And in the Sullivan system, memory was a threat. Speech was a violation. And anything resembling testimony had to be neutralized, quickly, cleanly, without causing panic. Because if even one child escaped with true memory intact, The whole facade would collapse. And here's what's worse. 3 of those children have never been identified. To this day, no birth records, no family matches, no DNA profiles.
No trace.
Except one girl. In the last verified photograph, file tag SB19K, was seen pointing. Her face is blurred. Her mouth is sewn in the picture, but her arm is extended, and she's pointing directly at the camera. As if to say, what if I told you it was never about the basement? Not really. The brick, the dirt, the doors, the children, those were only the first layer of a much deeper structure. Because Sullivan didn't just build a home. He built a system, one so sophisticated it could replicate itself without blueprints, just through whispers, rituals, and repetition. A kind of psychic architecture embedded in behaviors, symbols, and stories. And by 1838, that system had spread. Not physically, not by rail or letter, but by invitation. The Sullivan family archives, those that haven't been destroyed, contain letters from distant estates, as far as Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and even upstate New York, all bearing the same strange phrasing. We have observed the silence. We request alignment. May the children serve. They weren't asking for help. They were asking for templates, designs for rooms, instructions for binding memory, scripts for what to say when a child starts asking about the mirrors, or the dreams, or the wet tapping sounds behind the walls. And the Sullivan response was always the same. We do not send instructions. We send visitors. And that's where the records end. But oral accounts, buried in rural folklore, pick up the trail. Stories of dark-coated men arriving at farms and orphanages, conducting tests on children to see who remembered improperly. Some were taken, others left behind, mute, confused, drawing the same symbols over and over. Spirals, doors, a black sun with no rays. And those who saw the visitors never forgot one thing. They never entered through the front. They came through basements, storm cellars, wells below the foundation. Because the Sullivan blueprint wasn't a place. It was a frequency. A psychological tone only certain minds, usually children, could hear. A kind of harmonic bait designed to pull them downward. Not just physically, but cognitively. And here's where it gets truly terrifying. Some of those children were returned. But they were different. Polite, quiet, overly obedient, too calm. They didn't cry anymore. Didn't flinch at loud sounds. Didn't recognize old toys. Some wouldn't even respond to their names unless spoken in reverse. And every single one of them, without fail, was found to have a scar running along the base of their skull. No medical history, no surgery, just a clean, deliberate mark, like something had been inserted or removed. What did Sullivan call it? Cleansing the filament of ancestral noise. In other words, editing memory at the source. And we're supposed to believe that program ended? That the visitors stopped? That basements like Sullivan's were never built again? Look around. They're just better hidden now. There was a woman. Her name never made the official records. Not in the town hall, not in the census, not in any of the newspaper clippings that managed to survive the 1837 courthouse fire. But among the few living descendants of the Sullivan estate workers, she is still whispered about. They called her the listener. She wasn't staff. Not technically. She never cleaned, cooked, or taught. She didn't wear the uniform. And yet, she was seen walking the halls at night, stopping in front of locked doors, standing perfectly still for hours at a time, listening. Some believed she could hear what the children were dreaming. Others thought she was dreaming for them. But whatever her role, there's one fact no one can deny. She survived. After the final quieting event of 1839, when the last of the original 19 children vanished from the Sullivan records, everyone assumed the basement was sealed and the project terminated. Bernard Sullivan died just 2 months later. Found in his library, hands burned black, eyes still open, whispering the same phrase over and over. She knows. She knows. She knows. They say his mouth kept moving even after he stopped breathing. And what happened next? The estate was locked, guarded, later auctioned. But several buyers turned it down without explanation. after visiting the basement. One man reportedly tore up the deed and fled back to Boston, screaming about the voice in the concrete. But years later, in 1852, during a controversial excavation under the rear stairwell, a chair was discovered. Not just a chair. Her chair. Wooden, hand-carved, worn at the armrests, positioned directly in front of a blackened wall. And behind that wall, buried in what should have been solid earth, they found a cavity 3 feet deep. Inside, not a skeleton, not a box, a book, but not written in English. In fact, not written in any recognizable language. The ink was deep red, nearly black. The pages were stiff, like they'd been soaked in resin. And on the inside cover, one line had been etched, not written, with something sharp. Sound survives structure. Even silence leaves a blueprint. The listener had left instructions. For whom? That's where the theories fracture. Some say she was trying to warn future generations, decode the trauma, expose the machine. Others believe she was recording, not to protect us, but to summon something back. And here's the part they don't talk about. That book? It was last seen in a private vault in Virginia in 1921. Since then, gone. Vanished from all records. But every so often, a strange volume turns up at an estate sale. Wrapped in burlap. Smelling like ash and metal. Ink that looks like it might still be wet. And always, page 1 is missing. The Sullivan case didn't vanish because it was boring. It vanished because it worked. Too well. It didn't just silence children. It didn't just destroy families. It created a template, a manual for psychological erasure disguised as care, discipline, or education. And the institutions took notice. By 1856, a suspiciously timed wave of behavioral reform facilities began to appear throughout the American South. From Virginia to Georgia, remote buildings were erected with nearly identical architectural choices. No central staircases. Cellars reinforced with stone. Thick walls lined with lime-washed brick. And always one room with no door. They called them reflection chambers. Doctors called them necessary. Children called them the rooms that changed your name. And here's the gut punch. Many of the headmasters and medical staff associated with these places were direct descendants or former employees of the Sullivan family. Coincidence? Not likely, because one name keeps showing up. Dr. Alton Greaves, a former clerk in the Sullivan estate. Later as specialist in youth behavior at the Belmont Facility for Moral Correction in 1860. Greaves was known for 2 things. Never raising his voice, carrying a journal made of animal hide, pages stitched with copper wire, not thread. He believed the soul could be pressurized into obedience through environmental manipulation. That light, sound, and architecture could suppress memory and rewrite identity without a single touch. And just like Sullivan, he didn't publish. He invited. Elite families sent their wayward children to Greaves. Prominent judges, clergy, even politicians. Not for punishment, but for adjustment. And when those children returned, they were model citizens. Too model. Their emotions seemed optional. Their eyes didn't follow light naturally. And one mother reported her son no longer cast a shadow in the afternoon sun. You think I'm exaggerating? In 1871, during a state inspection of one of Greaves' now abandoned institutions, investigators found a subbasement that hadn't been on any blueprints. Inside, 7 cots, each with restraints, each facing a wall covered in mirror shards, not full mirrors, just pieces, and drawn in charcoal above the head of each bed. Remember nothing, become everything. Greaves disappeared the next year. Vanished.
No funeral.
No letters. Only a final, cryptic note left behind in the lining of his journal. The basement is not beneath you. It's inside you. Waiting. Tell me again this was just a building in Virginia. No, this was an operating system. And it still runs today, quiet, institutional, polished. But underneath, it's the same code. Sullivan's code. Still listening. Still inviting. There's one question that haunts all of this. Not what happened, but why? Why go to such lengths to erase children? Not physically, but mentally, spiritually. Why construct a system so elaborate that it required silence as architecture, pain as curriculum, and memory as an enemy? The answer may lie in what was hidden, not just in the basement, but in the bloodline. A sealed document, dated 1831 and unearthed during a failed estate acquisition in 1942, was quietly refiled under the name Project Rebes. One copy was smuggled out before reclassification. The contents? Terrifying. It wasn't a ledger. It wasn't a will. It was a genealogical chart not of the Sullivan family but of the children. Their names weren't listed, just codes, symbols, matched to ancient lineages, some traced back to the Bavarian Illuminat, others to outlawed sects of the Mandeans, and one to a vanished tribe from the Anatolian region said to possess the voice that splits spirit from form. Whoever compiled this chart wasn't documenting a family. They were breeding something, but not in the traditional sense. It appears Sullivan and his advisors believed certain children carried acoustic anomalies, vocal frequencies or tonal responses that didn't just express emotion but shaped the space around them. One line from the Rebes document. 3 spoke before they could crawl. 2 wept in tones that made glass ripple. 1 sang in the dark, and the dark obeyed. Let that sink in. These weren't troubled children. They were carriers. And the experiments? They weren't meant to hurt them. They were meant to awaken something buried so deep, only terror and silence could unearth it. And it worked. One of them, Child X, 7, referenced repeatedly across Rebes documents, reportedly triggered a blackout that fried every gas lamp and caused the estate's dogs to die simultaneously. After that, all records of X7 cease. But strange patterns emerge in other places. Reports of a girl in Illinois who could erase sound by closing her eyes. A boy in Louisiana whose hum made bones ache for miles. A teen in Maryland whose heartbeat couldn't be tracked because it matched no known rhythm, natural or mechanical. They weren't isolated cases. They were remnants. Children who slipped through. Children who remembered the walls. Children who carried the code in their throats. And this is where it gets even darker. What if the Sullivan Project didn't fail? What if it succeeded and was simply renamed, relocated, and refined? Look at certain boarding schools. Look at the military academies with sensory deprivation drills. Look at juvenile programs funded by silent corporations with no listed owners. They don't need basements anymore, because now, the rooms are digital. The silence is programmed. And the children, they're not hidden. They're streaming. You're probably wondering, if this is true, why haven't we heard more? Where are the whistleblowers? Where are the lawsuits, the survivors, the proof? Simple. They erased the proof. But more horrifying than that, they rewrote the survivors. There's a term buried in post-World War II psychiatric studies, never formally adopted, but quietly circulated among black site behavioral scientists: neural refraction. The theory that a mind subjected to targeted sensory inversion, silence where there should be noise, fear where there should be comfort, darkness in moments of joy, will eventually break. But not into pieces. It will break into a new shape, not erased, refracted. And refracted children don't testify. They don't remember what they saw. They don't even speak in the same voice they were born with. They blend perfectly, and they obey without ever knowing they're obeying. Here's where it gets cold. In 1958, long after the Sullivan estate had been purchased and restored, a minor archaeological survey was done beneath the foundation to determine the structural viability for a planned museum. 3 workers went down. Only one came back up. And he didn't say a word. Not then. Not ever. But he did something strange. For 14 straight days after that job, he returned to the edge of the property line at sunset. Just stood there. Never stepped inside again. Never went to work. Just stared. When police finally questioned him, he scribbled 6 words on a napkin. The dirt was breathing without lungs. He later died of a stroke at 37. Autopsy found no clots, no bleeding, no trauma. But his larynx collapsed inward, like it had swallowed its own echo. Does that sound natural to you? Now fast forward. 2021. A group of amateur paranormal documentarians breaks into the old property, now a historical preserve. They're live streaming, laughing, until they reach the cellar. You can still find the footage, though it's been taken down and re-uploaded dozens of times. The screen goes black.
No audio.
But the transcript of the subtitles, which somehow remain, reads, "Why is the air remembering me? Then nothing." 4 out of 5 members deleted all social accounts. One was institutionalized for hyperlinguistic hallucinations. She could hear words in objects. Her diagnosis? Cognitive collapse due to proximity encoding. What does that mean? It means her brain registered a location like a language. It means the basement spoke, and her mind, against her will, answered. Ask yourself, if a room can rewrite you, how many rooms have you already entered? Willingly? Unknowingly? And which of them are still listening? You want to know the worst part? It's not the silence, not the missing children, not even the genetic records, the basement, or the voice that made dogs die. It's this: nobody ever left the Sullivan estate. Not really. Because when you embed trauma into the bones of a place, when you design fear like architecture, it doesn't end when the doors are locked or the keys are buried. It infects. The house may be empty, but the memory of the pain becomes its own entity. Parasite with no body, only presence. This isn't ghost story territory. This is frequency science. A 1997 classified DARPA study explored resonant trauma fields. The theory was simple. Extreme emotional events, especially those involving children, don't just get remembered. They get stored. Not in a person, not in a diary, but in matter itself. Wood, brick, soil, even air. Matter becomes memory's cage. And sometimes, rarely, that cage leaks. One such leak occurred in 2006, when a construction team doing minor earthquake retrofitting on the estate's western wing reported spatial hallucinations. What does that mean? It means they saw walls move, not collapse, not shake, shift, as if the house didn't want them walking in certain directions, as if it was rerouting them like a GPS, but not to avoid traffic, to avoid disruption. One worker collapsed. He was found mumbling phrases not in English. Later analysis confirmed the phonetics matched a now extinct variant of pre-Coptic Egyptian, a language associated with ritual muting ceremonies performed on children to prepare them for dream passage. Let me repeat that. He spoke a forgotten language no one ever taught him, because he touched the wrong beam. And there are blueprints, original sketches from 1833, of the Sullivan basement floor plan. They don't show what you expect. There's no prison cell.
No chance.
Just angles. Impossible ones. Staircases that end in walls. Hallways that turn into themselves. Corners that exceed 360 degrees, architecturally meaningless. Unless the design wasn't for humans. Unless it was for the sound. To trap it. Or worse, to feed it. One letter from a visiting French scholar in 1835, who vanished a week later, described the space as a geometry built to starve language and breed its shadow. He claimed the walls remembered what wasn't said. Think about that. Not what was spoken, but what wasn't. And if that's true, if silence was harvested like oil, then the Sullivan estate isn't just haunted. It's hungry. And its favorite meal? The sound of a child being forgotten. By now, you're probably asking, what was the goal? Why would anyone build a place like this? Why would they twist geometry into psychological weapons? Why would they turn silence into a language and children into echoes? Here's the answer. It wasn't about killing. It was about harvesting. You've heard of energy vampires, sure, fiction. But what about emotional transduction centers? That's a term found once in a declassified 1963 CIA internal white paper titled Transspatial Perception Fields in Pediatric Minds. In simpler words, children perceive dimensions adults can't. Because their minds haven't collapsed into linear logic yet. They experience space as suggestion, not fact. Time as music, not measurement. And the Sullivans knew that. Or rather, the people who funded them did. We traced it. A silent benefactor in 1833. Name withheld in all documentation. But his personal seal, A sigil of a downward spiral inside a child's open eye matches exactly with a crest found on the Temple of Silent Knowing, a long-rumored psychological warfare division within the pre-Federalist American Masonic orders. You heard that right. Before America even had a flag, there were men designing places of forgetting. Not for prisoners, not for enemies, for their own bloodlines. Why? Because to rule from shadows, you need generations of compliance. You don't just control the body. You don't even control the mind. You control the conditions in which minds are formed. You starve them of safety. You break sound into confusion. You turn the word love into a sound that echoes too long. And in that void, you introduce obedience. But not like what you think. Not the military kind. The deeper kind. The kind that doesn't feel like control. Because it feels like your own voice. The Sullivan children, those not listed in census reports, they weren't killed. They were rewritten. The world received them like any other orphan. They were placed, raised, promoted. They became teachers, bankers, judges, pastors. And they had children of their own, children who heard stories in the dark. Stories they could never repeat. Not because they were told not to, but because language itself abandoned them. And that right there is the goal. To create generations of silence so perfect, you don't need to hide the basement. Because the ones who lived it won't even remember where the door is. And you may have walked by it already. You may have even dreamed of it. The cracked wooden door, the steps that creak downward, the smell of damp stone, and something underneath it. Listening. This is your last warning. Because what I'm about to tell you doesn't belong to history. It belongs to you. You see, the Sullivan estate was never about the estate. It was about the template. A design so precise, so devastatingly effective, it could be replicated anywhere, without bricks, without blood. Just ideas. Just trauma. The angles in that basement, they now exist in urban planning software. The soundproofing techniques, they're now embedded in school architecture. The child reprogramming experiments, they've simply been rebranded as curriculum innovation. Do you understand? We live inside the evolved Sullivan prototype. You and I, because you don't need a hidden basement to forget. All you need is a society engineered to reward silence, punish memory, and smile while doing it. Now listen carefully. In 2021, a file leaked anonymously onto a fringe message board. Its file name, Sullivan_SYNTH. Inside were 63 architectural diagrams, each one rendered with exact Sullivan geometries, just modernized. You know what they matched? Daycare centers, hospitals, high-security psychiatric wings, and more chilling than all, public libraries. You thought the monsters lived underground, but they've moved above you, beside you, inside you. And the reason you've always felt like something's missing, something in your childhood you can't quite name, is because it was designed that way. The Sullivan blueprint wasn't about hiding children. It was about hiding you from yourself. Every time you forget your own voice in a room full of noise, every time you freeze when you should speak, every time you feel like something happened, but can't quite say what, that's not trauma. That's architecture. They didn't bury the children. They used them to build a world where forgetting is survival. But now you know. And here's the most dangerous part of all. The house still exists. Not in Virginia. Not physically. But psychologically. It exists in the people who walked out. It exists in their children. And maybe, if this story made your skin crawl, it exists in you. That chill you feel? It's not fear. It's recognition. You've been there before. Not in body. In blueprint. Now the question is, will you knock on the door again? Or will you finally walk away,